Okay, we'll wait a moment or two. Still a little bit early, and then we'll start. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you can hear me. I think I'm unmuted. And what we're going to do today is look at the poems, some of the poems, of World War I. I told you the packet of poems is posted on Blackboard under the tab. I think it says poems. And that's what we'll be doing today. On Monday, we'll be moving, Tuesday, which is the last day of class, we'll be looking at the artwork of World War I. I don't think I've moved it over yet, but sometime today I'll move over the tab of artwork so that you have that also for Tuesday's class, and you can look at the reproductions of some of the representative works of art that go along with World War I. So that's pretty much where it stands. We move towards the end. This happens every semester, always come up short, never enough time. But I think I've honed the selection of poems to a manageable and representative group. So you have some idea of what World War I poetry is all about, some of the more important works. And now I've already misplaced, what did I do with it? Just 1 second. It's in the packet. In the packet of poems, there's a piece from, I believe, the New York Times that I've reproduced. It's worth looking at. It's a good introduction. And it's the Wall Street Journal. And probably it was at some point during the celebration of the centennial of World War I. And like I said, the poems of World War I, really stand out as the prime cultural aspect of the war. There were some really great war poets. Virtually all of them were veterans. Unfortunately, some of them actually died during World War I, and therefore the poems appeared posthumously. But this article appeared in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know the date, unless maybe I don't know the date. Anyway, it was, I think, around 2017. And I don't want to read the whole thing, but it's very, very interesting. He writes, "Do you remember that stirring poem about poppies taught to a million of Americans in elementary school?" We're going to read that poem. That poem is the quintessential World War I poem. And it is in part, I took the first verse, is on the syllabus, in Flanders Fields. Like I said, the model of a World War I poem, and you'll see why when we get to it. But he's asking, remember when you were in school, elementary school, and you had to read that poem? And then he quotes a line or two. "We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields." Right? And that's the name of the poem, Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields by Canadian soldier John McCrae has survived time's pull, right? People still read it, and its imagery, as you'll see, is long-lasting and really eternal. By the way, we'll speak more about it. John McCrae was not only a Canadian World War I poet. John McCrae was a doctor, was a medical doctor, and he was sent over in World War I because at that time, Canada was part of the Dominion, the British Dominion. And if you were either Dominion nation like Canada, New Zealand, or Australia, or you were part of the empire, that is, you were a colony, you had to send your soldiers to fight in World War I, together with the British. World War I, the Great War, has been over for a century. Most of its stories don't recall the triumph of good over evil as in World War II, nor do they give off the chivalrous tone that framed the 19th century conflicts. There was no Hitler, to defeat, and little distinction between black and white, right and wrong. The world witnessed the sickening consequences of modern warfare. There was no precedent for such horror. The men who fought in the Great War couldn't anticipate the destruction they would both cause and endure. Never before had life been wiped out in such magnitude and across such a vast stage. There were an estimated 18 million deaths and 41 million casualties from 1914 to 18. Now, these numbers, every time I read it, the numbers seem to increase. But there were probably about 11 million war casualties, fatalities, deaths, probably a few million civilian deaths. Maybe that's how they come up with 18 million. But as we are painfully aware, as we sit here today, that wasn't the end. World War I then gave way to the first major pandemic of the 20th century. That was the Spanish flu. Another 5 million or so dead. It's a pretty devastating time. And the Spanish flu gave rise to yet more literature. There are many novels and poems that derive their themes and their settings also from the pandemic of the Spanish flu in 1919 through 1921. And then he talks about a young nurse named Vera Brittain, who wrote a number of poems. I could read them also about World War I, her experiences of being a nurse on the front. Many of the most famous poets were killed in the war, like Rupert Brooke, who wrote of quote, a corner of a foreign field that is forever England, end quote. He died in Greece, 1915. One of the poets we're going to look at, if we have time in the packet, is a guy by the name of Alan Seeger. Alan Seeger died in 1916, I believe, also on the Western Front. What's interesting about Seeger is if you're a certain vintage or you're into popular culture, you might not have ever heard of Alan Seeger, but I bet you heard of his nephew, Pete Seeger, the folk singer, right? That was his uncle, right? So all these famous figures. One final haunting poem will stick with me forever. It's the work of Wilfred Owen, a British poet. It's called Dulce et Decorum Est. We're going to look at it today. It's one of the quintessential poems of the period too. And if you think back to a week or so ago and All Quiet on the Western Front, remember in the movie version, and also it shows up in the novel, that professor who's doing all he can to motivate and fire up his students to go off to fight for the fatherland. On the blackboard is the title of a poem by the Roman poet and orator Horace, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And he quotes that in translation. It's good and proper to die for one's country, right? And that is one of the really well-known and important British poems of the war, right? And we're going to look at it shortly. And then he ends up this article by saying, these are the real honest accounts, not a page from a textbook recalling events at a remove. The words are true. They show the horror of war more accurately than any document can begin to convey. The words call us to pay heed. They offer lessons. They haunt. And haunted, we remember how it was that, quote, the war to end all wars, end quote, the final ultimatum. Remember and we laugh and we weep and we fail to understand dulce et decorum est, indeed. And what he means by that, you'll see when we get to the poem. The poet, Wilfred Owen, is being sarcastic in quoting that line from Horace. But the poem we're going to begin with, and it's the first one in the packet, is called In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. So it's an extraordinarily moving poem, and the circumstances in which he wrote it also are quite moving. And basically what happened was McCrae was born in Guelph, Ontario, Canada. And as a youngster, he developed an interest in poetry and really wrote poems throughout his life. Then, of course, he opted to go into the field of medicine, and he, I believe, got his degree from McGill University or the University of Toronto, one of the two. He taught at one of the two. And actually then taught for a while and had an internship, I think, at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. But then he enrolled in the Canadian Expeditionary Force at the outbreak of World War I. He was then 41 years old. And he had an option. He could have joined the medical corps because of his training and his age, certainly beyond the normal age to enter combat. But he volunteered. And instead he joined a gunner corps, gunner unit, and he also became a medical officer. And it was in his second tour of duty that one of his close friends and comrades was shot and killed on the Western Front. And that's what basically led to his writing this particular poem. It was actually at the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. And to memorialize his friend, he sat down and he wrote this particular poem, which first appeared in the magazine, the London magazine Punch. Actually, I haven't got it here. It's in my library in the other room. A few years ago, I was actually able to find the first edition of In Flanders Fields, the poems, in a hardbound volume with a couple of other war poems by McCrae as well. And but again, it's one of the most quoted war poems of all. As it turns out, sadly, McCrae himself became ill, and he developed, I think it was pneumonia, basically, and he died as a result of World War I, not in combat, indirectly, rather from disease. And so in a sense, it's both a memorial to his friend and a last will and testament, in a sense, to McCrae himself. He's been honored a great deal. There's a stamp that was issued in 1968, obviously on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, by the Canadian government. And if you're interested, by the way, in a more popular account of the Western Front and all of this, you could read Winston Groom's book on World War I, A Field in Flanders. It's interesting, where he takes the title from this poem. It's the same Winston Groom who wrote Forrest Gump, but he wrote this rather interesting piece about the Western Front in World War I. In any case, as I said, the author, poet, McCrae, became ill, actually it's pneumonia, and died January 28th of 1918. War ended 9 months later, basically. And this was his legacy, amongst other things. So let's look at the poem and then see what exactly is going on. What is the power of this particular poem? What is it in the way of imagery that has remained, the potent symbol, really, of World War I? Okay, the name of the poem, again, In Flanders Fields. And of course, Flanders is that part of Belgium where most of the combat took place in the early going and throughout, really, World War I. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard among the guns below. Right, so let's look at this first verse. The rhyme scheme, of course, is A, B, C, A, B. Yes. A, B, B, C, A. Goes back to the initial rhyme. Blow, row, sky, fly, below. Rhyme. Typical traditional verse form. So we're in Flanders Fields. You have to ask, who exactly is narrating it? Who's speaking, right? Who's telling over this tale? Or who's the one who's narrating what's going on? So keep that in mind, right? And what about these poppies? Right, so poppies became, because of this poem, the symbol of World War I. Way back when, even before my time, I guess, it used to be that November 11th was known as Armistice Day. Because November 11th, remember, the 11th hour of the 11th month, 11th day, was the armistice that ended World War I. And so it became known as Armistice Day, and it was celebrated, consequently, for all the years after, as a memorial to the veterans and the ones who died in World War I. So how was Armistice Day celebrated? World War I veterans, and when they were no longer around, other veterans of the military would stand on street corners on November 11th, and they would hand out these little paper red poppies to put in your lapel. Okay, so poppy is a flower, right? And apparently a flower that grew ubiquitously all over that part of Europe. What is the symbolism of the poppy? It's red. It's red like blood. It's blood red. So it represents, obviously, the sacrifice of the soldiers who died for the cause, shed their blood, which was, which seeped into the earth of Europe. But poppy has another connotation. This was, after all, written by a physician, a doctor. And the other connection, or the other association with the poppy flower, or the poppy seed, is what? It is used as a, painkiller. Back in the day, before science had progressed to the point where you could perform surgery with, nowadays they put you out. It was, these various forms of gas that, make you numb to pain, or even put you out, you're not even awake and aware, or various types of drugs that be shot into the vein to numb the pain for local anesthesia, whatever. So poppy, in the medical sense, was used as a painkiller and as something to dull the senses when one had to undergo certain types of surgery. So it has those two meanings. It's red blood, red like blood, but it also has the characteristic, or the ability to numb pain. And both of those images or connections appear and are relevant to the poem. By the way, of course, World War I was followed by World War II. So Armistice Day, November 11th, was no longer confined to remembering World War I, but now it included World War II, and it's now known as Memorial Day. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Veterans Day. And but every once in a while, you can still see those red poppies that are distributed on Veterans Day as well. So back to the poem. We're in Flanders fields, and these poppy flowers, they're flowing or blowing all over the place because the wind is lifting them. Where are they blowing? Between the crosses, row on row. It's a cemetery. It's a military cemetery. And between the crosses that mark the graves of all these soldiers, these red poppy flowers are flying all over the place between them, that mark our place, that mark where we are now, right? So again, I asked, from whose perspective, or who's the narrator of this poem? It's being narrated, it's being told by a dead soldier. It's basically a voice from the hereafter, right? And the soldier who's buried in Flanders fields is telling over this tale to the reader. And when he says the poppies and the gravestones or the crosses mark our place, they're showing where we are. We are the dead. were the soldiers who didn't make it. And here we are in a cemetery in Flanders Field. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. The larks, the birds. So the birds are flying way up in the sky, and but they're not heard. You don't hear the sounds of the chirping of the larks or whatever. Why? Because they're flying above the guns and the cannons and everything else down below. Down below, there's a war going on. And so that war has obliterated the sounds of nature that are heard above the sounds of war. We are the dead, right? There it is. It says it outright. We are the dead with a capital D. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. We're the dead. He's speaking for all of these soldiers who are dead. And they were young, right? They're soldiers. They were kids. And before, just a few days before they were shot down, they had all of the experiences and the expectations and the exuberations and everything else of youth, right? They were young and they were shot down, right? So their lives ended. And now there they are, bodies buried in Flanders fields, no longer the feeling of love or watching the glow of a sunset or the dawning of a day, right? It's all in the past. So in the first verse, he's set the location and the background. In the second verse, he speaks directly as a representative of the dead soldiers. And now in the third verse, he speaks to those who are still here, the ones who have remained. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. In other words, you who are left, those of you who haven't been killed, you have to continue the battle. We're handing the torch to you as if it were a relay, right? You get now the torch is in your hand. Be yours to hold it high, right? Hold it high and continue the battle. If you break faith with us who die, if you don't do that, if you don't carry on the battle, if you break faith with us, we gave our lives for this endeavor, for this undertaking. And if you don't carry on, we shall not sleep. There'll be no rest for us, because then we'll have died in vain. Though poppies grow in Flanders fields, even though the poppies will continue to grow, nature will continue to manifest itself, right? Nature is eternal, and war or no war, it'll just keep, there'll be another spring after every winter. But if you break faith with us, who gave our young lives for the cause, then there'll be no rest for us. There'll be no sleep. And those poppies, which secondarily represent, the medicine that induces sleep, that induces, that's the antidote to pain, right? Those poppies can keep flying around, but there'll be no rest for us. Because we'll have died for nothing. We'll have died in vain. So it's for you who are still here to carry on, take the torch, and continue our fight so that it was not for naught. And then, knowing that you have continued the battle, we can rest in peace and have the sleep-induced poppy peace and painlessness that we're at least entitled to now that we're gone. So this poem, as I said, it's the classic World War I poem. The imagery of the poppy in all of its manifestations, obviously, is a very potent symbol for warfare, for death, for blood-drenched earth, and so on and so forth, but also for the medicinal effect of the poppy. At least these soldiers are entitled to a peaceful afterlife, right? They're entitled to at least rest in peace. And have that comfort, knowing that we're carrying on their battle. Let's see, I just want to make sure we have enough time. Maybe we'll go back to Rendezvous with Death, because there are two other poems that are really significant. All right, and one of them, a few pages later, there's a poem by Siegfried Sassoon. It's called Suicide in the Trenches. And let me tell you something about Sassoon, an interesting guy. We gather by his name, his biography, that this was a sort of unusual individual. After all, the first name doesn't seem to match the second name. Siegfried, we think of Siegfried, well, typically German name, a very Wagnerian name, Wagner opera. You'll see how he ended up with that name. Anyway, Siegfried Lorenz Sassoon was born in 1886. He died in 1967. He was a poet, a writer, a soldier. He was decorated for his bravery on the Western Front in the First World War and became one of the leading poets of the First World War. And he describes the horrors of the trenches and so on, as you'll see in this particular poem. He was a very good friend, close friend of Wilfred Owen, another poet we're going to look at, a very important poet. Now, Sassoon, interesting story. The name Sassoon is of Middle Eastern origin. His father was the descendant of a very prominent and wealthy Jewish merchant family in Baghdad, Iraq. And the Sassoons were major, not only commercial figures, but also great benefactors and philanthropists. But his father, the poet's father, married a Catholic woman, and the family disowned him. Married out of the faith, and he was disowned. So the poet, Siegfried, had little, if any, contact at all with his father's family. But he lived in a nice, big estate in England. His father was also a wealthy man. And he engaged in sports and all sorts of things, a big soccer player, a rugby player. And also, but his mother was a more artistic type. And his mother, in fact, her brother was a big architect, famous architect in England. And his mother just was enamored of German culture and of operas by Wagner. That's why she said, I'm naming him Siegfried, for the famous, warrior in medieval German literature. So that's how we got the name Siegfried. Fought in World War I, was decorated for his valor and so on. He was wounded at one point. After the war was over, in later life, he became a totally committed pacifist and very much left-wing in his politics. I would basically say a Marxist, right? Very strong left-wing political leanings. And he wrote many, many poems regarding his experiences in World War I. And this next poem that we're going to look at, called Suicide in the Trenches, a few pages later. Very interesting, short, to the point, very powerful poem. And it includes a number of the issues and a number of the themes that we've encountered throughout the course of the semester. First of all, the notion of the horror of trench warfare, and specifically the impact on youth, on young kids, right? These are kids. Remember way back when we began this unit on literature, we talked about that's told by the schoolmaster and that young boy who was below recruitment age and lied to get into the army. And that was not an uncommon experience. There were just a lot of youth who were caught up in the nationalist hoopla or wanted some adventure somewhere. And even though there were children, went off to fight for England. Then we saw this in the context of Germany and quite on the Western Front. These youngsters were basically encouraged to go off and fight for the fatherland. And again, had all of these children, really, who had no idea what they were getting into. I mean, you think about all part on the Western Front and the comrades of Paul Bäumer and the experience that they met when they actually got there, as opposed to the romantic notion of war they had before, right? Well, that's very much what's happening in this poem by Sassoon called Suicide in the Trenches. You already know what's going to happen in the title. People have suggested that if it were written by Wilfred Owen or someone more, a different type of poet, perhaps more tactful or subtle, he wouldn't have given it that title. And in my opinion, they're right. Knowing from the title what's going to happen sort of undermines the impact of the poem. Better to have given it a different title and then shock the reader with the final, with the final line. But in any case, that's what it's called. So the poem begins, I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled early with the lark. Okay. The word in the first verse, a simple soldier boy. I don't think he means simple as in stupid. I think he's simple as in innocent and naive. This kid doesn't understand the concept of war. He's been sent over, and there he is, and totally, naive, totally lacking comprehension of what's going on around him. Interestingly, the word simple, also applies to the poem and its structure itself. There's a very simple syntax to this poem, very simple, straightforward sentences, no embellishments and no fancy, complex sentence structure, right to the point, which fits and dovetails very nicely with the notion of the character of this guy, who's a simple, green behind the ears kid. And this simple soldier boy, and essentially he doesn't call him just a soldier, he's a soldier boy, because he really is a boy. He's a kid, more than he's a soldier, who grinned at life in empty joy, right? He was a happy-go-lucky kid. He grinned at life. Everything was good. Whatever happened in a positive way, he was thrilled with it. No deep thoughts and no great expectations, just happy-go-lucky as he went along, pleased with everything. He slept soundly through the lonesome dark and whistled early with the lark, right? At night, in the trench, it's dark and he's alone, but he slept soundly. And then he got up early in the morning and started whistling, and he heard the chirping or the whistling of the larks flying through the sky. Verse 1. In winter, now, that's pretty positive, sort of a wholesome view of things. True, it's a war, but we have an image of a happy-go-lucky and basically content kid, and images of nature, larks flying in the sky, and the whole thing. Now the second verse. In winter trenches, cowed and glum with crumps and lice and lack of rum. All right, now the image changes, and the description is, to say the least, somewhat harsher, because now it's the winter, and we know what winter trenches were, right? Full of ice and snow and all sorts of creatures crawling around, or embedded dead bodies in the wall of the trench and so on. So now it's in a winter trench, cowed and glum, not so happy anymore. He's cowed, he's scared, and he's glum, he's unhappy, with crumps and lice and lack of rum. And crumps can mean two things here. Crump is sort of the stifled sound of falling bombs and projectiles that you hear when you're in the trench. So this crump sound are the different weapons that are being shot over from the other side, and that's how they sound when they land in the soil. But we also know the crumps are something else. They're also sort of a skin disease and an itchy kind of a thing. So there in the glum of the winter trench with crumps and lice and lack of rum. Lice and lack of rum. A lot of alliteration in the poem. Lice, lack, so on, right? So on the one hand, we have sound. You hear the crump of the falling bomb. The lice and the lack of rum, because of the alliteration, you can taste it and you can feel it. Right? You can feel the lice as it digs into your flesh. And the lack of rum, the lack of taste of rum. Why is rum important? Because obviously these soldiers, regardless of age, were provided with alcohol. Alcohol was a way of dealing with the various unpleasantnesses of being in the trench. But now it's missing. No lack, there's plenty of lice and plenty of crumbs, but no rum. He put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. Okay, again, alliteration. Bullet, brain. What did he do? Obviously, he was depressed because now we're in the winter trench and he couldn't take it anymore. Took his own gun and shot himself through his head, and no one spoke of him again. Gone and forgotten, right? Why? Because he's one of unending numbers of casualties of war, right? And what Sassoon is saying is that you're just a number when you're fighting like that, and it could be here 1 minute and gone the next minute. Same is true of all of your comrades, and so no one stops to really consider the loss of this young life, because it's just one of many, right? And totally forgotten, oblivious, and unremembered. And then the third verse, which is really an indictment. And we have to say, who's he talking to in the third verse? These smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who cheer when soldier lads march by. He's talking to the crowds of patriotic, nationalistic individuals who are, cheering the crowds, the young kids that go off to war. What do they know? They're not going, right? But they're full of enthusiasm and firing them up to go off. Kindling, right? What is kindling? It's when you light a fire. They have fire in their eyes, right? Because of the show of emotion, show of passion, show of patriotism, and so on. He's saying it's what it is hypocrisy. Right? Because they cheer as these young soldiers go by and make a show or display of their nationalism, but they're not going, right? And they're not going to be shot down. And then after the soldiers march off, sneak home and pray, you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Right? After you put up this phony display of patriotism and cheered on the young troops who are going to go off to be slaughtered on the continent, when sneak home. In other words, don't be so proud of yourself. When someone sneaks somewhere, it's because they're ashamed. So be ashamed, sneak home. And when you get there, pray that you'll never know the hell that these guys are going to, right? Because as we saw previously in the last verse, that's the end of youth and laughter. From the first verse, when this youngster was a positive, happy-go-lucky kid, to the second verse, when he can take it no longer in the depression of the winter trench and kills himself, you go to the third verse, where the poet turns his ire and attention on the crowds and tells them, look, you put on this whole display of nationalism and patriotism and gung-ho war fever. Just remember, the cost is the loss of youth. You're not going to be the one who's going, so don't be so hypocritical and cold-blooded. It's the youth. It's the ones who have the whole life ahead of them. They're the ones who are going to sacrifice their lives. First, they're going to suffer, and then they're going to die. So it's one of the many poems. You'll see the most famous one, which is the one by Wilfred Owen. Same idea, same message at the end. Now, there's a very, very long poem stuck here in the middle by Emmanuel Saul. I'm not going to read this whole poem. And frankly, probably most people have never heard of Emmanuel Saul. So you're asking, why did I include this poem? And to a certain extent, it's for maybe personal reasons. You'll see why. Emmanuel Saul, the name of the poem is To My Children. It's a poem he wrote to his children before he left to go off to war, World War I. Emmanuel Saul was a German Jew. And he had fought in the Franco-Prussian War. That was back in 1870. Now we're in 1918. Obviously, he's not a young man. So why is he going off to war? He's married. He's a lawyer. He has a family. No one expects him to go off and fight in a war. But he decided it's his patriotic duty that he owes it to the fatherland. He owes it to Germany. Why? All right, so we digress for a moment. German Jews were the most patriotic of all the Germans. They loved Germany with a passion that was over the top. Probably there are reasons why. One, many of them who came from Eastern Europe had experienced all of the, the suffering and the anti-Semitism and the viciousness and victimization, everything else in Eastern Europe. And I think Germany is like paradise compared to all of that. Germany also, at a certain point during the Enlightenment period, opened up many opportunities to Jews: university, education, all sorts of commercial opportunities. They were no longer ghettoized. They can now live in big cities amongst the rest of the population and so on. So there's a tremendous love of Germany and a certain feeling that this was our home. So when it came to World War I, this was their opportunity to show just what Germany meant to them and to prove to anyone who doubted it, they were just as German, more German than everyone else. They were ready to go off and die for the fatherland. There's a book, came out recently, about a year or so ago. I have it in my library. I believe it's called Deadly Legacy: German Jews in the Great War. German Jews couldn't wait to sign up. They were all gung-ho supportive of the war effort because this is a manifestation of their love of Germany. And the truth is, they realized on some level that no matter what, a good portion of the German population hated them anyway. They were never really accepted. In their minds, they were accepted, but in reality, they really weren't. So they wanted to show and remove all doubt that they were just as German as everybody else. There's a parallel in World War I in America. There were significant numbers of African Americans who fought in World War I with the American Expeditionary Force. And for many of them, including one very famous actor/singer, entertainer, who said that he didn't even have to go, but he said, I'm going to fight with this country because I want them to realize that I, a Black American, just as American as everyone else, and hopefully when I get back and when my comrades get back, they'll finally accord us the rights that everyone else has. It didn't happen. Not only didn't it happen, but there was an intentional slighting of Black American war veterans. What happened was, as troop ships came back, they intentionally held Black soldiers last before all the white soldiers got off the boat. And intentionally, because they wanted them to know, just because you fought for us overseas, nothing's changed back home. You still have the status you had before. The Jim Crow laws are still there, and don't have delusions of grandeur that you're equal to us. It isn't happening. By the way, didn't change much in World War II. Just like in World War I, in World War II, there were Black units that fought, but they were segregated from the rest of the army. And when they got back, basically they had to face the same discriminatory laws that were there when they left. Right? Same thing happened here, same thing happened there. But it was in some ways worse in Germany, because in Germany, they lost World War I. And when they lost, someone had to be blamed. And who are you going to blame? Right? The obvious scapegoats, the Jews, the pacifists, and the communists. And even though Jews fought for Germany in World War I in greater percentages than non-Jews, because the Jews are less than 2% of the population, yet a significant portion of Jews fought proportionately much more compared to their small slice of the population as the rest. Nevertheless, the Germans, when they lost the war, tried to claim the Jews didn't fight. Well, numbers don't lie, and although you can lie with numbers, numbers don't lie. And when it was shown that that's not true, they said, okay, well, all right, so the Jews participated in World War I, but they didn't die in the same numbers, because after all, they all had desk jobs. Wasn't true. It's the exact opposite. Jews died actually in a greater proportion. So then, when that didn't work, they came up with the famous stab in the back myth, which I think I mentioned in the past. The Germans said, you know, we never lost the war. The only thing that was that there were guys back home who stabbed us in the back, the Jews. Said they didn't support the war. And therefore, they were agitating against the war. And therefore, it cost, you know, the sort of commitment of the rest of Germans, and, you know, it lessened the strength of conviction that the German soldiers had. And that's why they lost the war, was the Jews were stabbed in the back. I think I mentioned that stab in the back, actually talking about Siegfried, it relates to the story of Siegfried in the medieval German epic, where he's stabbed in the back and so on. And that's where they got it from. So basically, Jews took it coming and going, and the end of World War I, and that defeat is what led slowly to the success and the program of the Nazis. So that gets back to the poem by Emanuel Saul. Here's a guy, didn't have to fight. He was an older gentleman. He was a lawyer. He had a family. But he is going off to fight for the fatherland. And he, so early on, he died on the Eastern Front in Russia in 1915. But before he left this long poem for his children. I'll just read a part of it. It's to my children. When I left home to fight for fatherland, against the threat of danger and deceit, you children happily round me ran, rejoicing in your father's bravery, his uniform and other warlike clothes, and in his newfound worth and bravery, all hid from childlike sight was what it means when now your father leaves for war and death. But later, when you are mature and wise, but when perhaps my bones far east may lie, bleaching alone under a wooden cross, then dread and horror you may start to feel, and you will think about that far off time when we all said farewell for the last time. And then he goes on and on to the glory of Germany and German culture. And that. It's also one very interesting point, and then we'll go on. He says, you know, when you read this, my children, I'll probably have died in war, buried somewhere in the East. And my bones will be bleaching alone under a wooden cross. Why would they be under a wooden cross? He's a Jew. But what he's saying is, you know what? I'm part of the folk. He goes on, so I'm part of the community. I'm part of the people. I'm part of the Germans. Yeah, I'm Jewish, but I'm dying for the fatherland, dying for Germany. And what's going to happen? All the soldiers who die for Germany, they're going to be buried in military cemeteries, and crosses are going to be put up all over the place, regardless of what your background, your religion is. And that's probably where you'll find my last remains. And so it goes. The reason I included it is because to me, it is one of the greatest examples of the tragedy of what happened to German Jews. And World War I was the turning point. Had the Germans not lost World War I, maybe things would have turned out differently going forward. But, you know, if I had wheels, I'd be a trolley car. And we have to deal with reality. And the reality is that that war changed the world. And in the subcontext of of the Jews of Germany and their history, that was the turning point towards ultimately what led to Auschwitz. And this guy is a sad example of the self-deception that was unfortunately so prevalent amongst German Jews who thought they were just as beloved and as a part of the German nation as everyone else. And let's go on to Wilfred Owen. The poem is Insensibility. It's also a very important poem and very powerful poem. We're going to read two of his poems, this being first. Okay. So Wilfred Owen, very sad story. He was a British soldier and fought in World War I. He was a very close friend of actually Siegfried Sassoon, a number of other poets. He actually, it's very sad, he died actually a week before the war ended. And the letter home to his mother about his death actually arrived after the war ended. So he was one of the last casualties of World War I. But his poetry is considered amongst the greatest of the World War I poets. So let's look at the poem. It's called Insensibility, and think about what that means. Become clear, I guess, as the poem moves on. Happier men who yet before they are killed can let their veins run cold. This should remind you of something we saw the other day in Storm of Steel, where Ernst Junger says, the best soldiers of all are the ones that are cold-blooded. Nothing phases them anymore. Basically what he's saying here is, the happiest of the men are the ones who basically have reached a point where they don't fret or, become too absorbed and overwhelmed by the possibility of their death. Whom no compassion flees or makes their feet sore on the alleys cobbled with their brothers. The front line withers, but they are troops who fade, not flowers. For poets, tearful fooling, men gaps of fulfilling, losses who might have fought longer, but no one bothers, right? And those he's describing soldiers who've reached the point where frankly they don't care anymore, and they just keep marching along, right? And these alleyways cobbled with their brothers, meaning what? It's not cobblestones they're walking over. The alleys are cobbled with their brothers. In other words, these are soldiers who've fallen, they're dead, and they're just marching right over them, right? And they fade away, not like flowers. Flowers come back. They fade away, and they're gone forever. And some cease feeling, some just don't care anymore, even themselves or for themselves. Dullness best solves the tease and doubt of shelling, and chance's strange arithmetic comes simpler than the reckoning of their shilling. They keep no check on army's decimation. Chance, what is chance? The capital C, right? It's fate. So they become dulled by fate, meaning what? Chance or fate is a strange arithmetic. It's not something you can calculate with arithmetic precision. Who can say who's going to be here and who's not going to be here? Bullet comes towards you, just happens to be a centimeter too off and hits the guy next to you, right? You can't make calculations. You can't figure these things out. They're their own logic. They're their own arithmetic or mathematical constructs, right? There is probably some sort of scheme that a mathematician can sit down and figure what odds are, but the bottom line is, from the perspective of the soldier, there's no math here, there's no logic, and there's no way of calculating. It happens or it doesn't happen. Happy are these who lose imagination. They have enough to carry with ammunition, right? They have enough to carry with their backpack and all the ammunition with them. They haven't got time for speculating or imagining or anything else. That's gone. You're stuck in the moment. And the moment is you got to carry your backpack, which is heavy. You got to march in those boots and so on. Their spirit drags no pack. Their old wounds, save with cold, cannot more ache, right? The wounds have been there so long that even time has dulled the pain of the wounds. We just take it as part of life. Having seen all things red, their eyes are rid of the hurt of the color of blood forever. They've seen everybody die already. They've seen blood flow. Doesn't faze them anymore, right? The color of blood no longer has the shock power or the effect that it had earlier on in their innocence. And terror's first constriction over, their hearts remain small drawn. Their hearts have contracted. They don't react with the same emotional or passionate response they did before, because by now they've pretty much seen it all, and all that they've seen has basically dulled their sense and their notion of shock and death. And I can't believe this. Where is that other poem? In your packet, you have Dulce et Decorum Est. Should be, maybe. If it isn't, I'm sure it is. I don't know why I haven't got it. It's left out, but I will read it to you. It should be there. If it isn't, I'll just post it separately. It's like probably the most important one of all the poems. I can't seem to find it. Just 1 second. Any of you, do you have the poems in front of you? Do you have it in your packet? Okay, excuse me, just wait 1 second. Let me check here. Wait here. Yes, okay. Does everyone have it? Dulce et Decorum Est. Okay, just to make sure, I'll post it again after, but it should be there as part of that packet. Again, Dulce et Decorum Est, it's Latin. And it means basically dulce, we have this, I guess, also in Spanish. It's sweet, sweet. Decorum means proper, doing things the proper way. Dulce et decorum est, it is right and or sweet and proper. What? Pro patria mori, to die for one's country. It's a line from the Roman orator Horace, and it's the title of this very famous poem by Wilfred Owen. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. So he's describing the soldiers, like old beggars under sacks, meaning they're carrying these heavy loads, they're bent over, and they are, they don't look like young soldiers anymore, but rather old, torn, broken beggars, coughing like hags, coughing miserably from the gas attacks and from the dust that's being lifted from the ground and so on. And toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, right? They're like sleepwalking through this whole thing at this point. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. They didn't have boots anymore. Remember how important that was from Wolfgar and the Western Front. And so they're marching without boots, bloodshod. Meaning what? Shod is like when you put the horse hoofs on a horse. They're shod. You put the metal horseshoe on. But here, they're bloodshod. They have no boots anymore. It's the blood that's on the bottom of their feet. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. There are gas attacks, and they're so out of it from this unending marching and unending war that they're almost oblivious even to the gas canisters that are right behind them. Oh, gas, gas, quick boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, right? Now they're weird. It's a gas attack. What do they yell out? Grab your helmet, right? Grab your helmet. It's a gas attack. And they're clumsily trying to put them on their head. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, but they didn't all make it. They didn't all get the helmet on in time, gas mask, and therefore they're fumbling around and they're like a flounder out of water. It's like flipping all over the place because the gas has descended. Dim through the misty panes of thick green light, as under green sea I see him drowning. The gas mask is, you can see through the front, but it's tinted green. So everything you see from behind the mask looking out is green, has a greenish tint. But he compares it to being under the green sea. And it's an apt comparison because, as we mentioned when we talked about the different weapons of war, if you are subject or victim to a gas attack, the gas seeps into your lungs and you have the feeling or the experience really of it feels like you're drowning, but you're not underwater. You're drowning on dry land because it's filling your lungs in such a way that you can't breathe as if you were underwater and was filling up with water. So the analogy or the comparison of the green tint through the gas mask to the ocean depths is an appropriate comparison to the feeling and the experience of basically, quote, drowning as the gas fills up your lungs. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. For the rest of his life, this soldier says, I'm going to always have the image of that other soldier as he succumbs to the gas attack. And he's as though he's drowning and he's choking and he's guttering and everything else. That image will stay with me forever. If in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in. And he's talking to the audience because he's trying to explain, I'm telling you what happened. You weren't there. If you were there and you saw what I saw, you would also see how we took this poor soldier who's sputtering and everything else and tossed him into a wagon to bring him to a army medic center or whatever, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face. All you can see with the white of his eyes, in such pain, the whites of his eyes shone, the pupils were back in his head. His hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Every time the wagon bounced on something or hit something, the blood from his lungs would come pouring out of his mouth. Obscene as cancer and bitter as the cut of vile. Absolutely disgusting, bitter, horrible. If you could see it, I saw it, you didn't. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest. If you had seen all of this and you'd experienced all of this, you would not be full of passion and delight and tell your children, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. If you saw all of this, experienced this, and had to dream of this for the rest of your life, you wouldn't be telling your children with all this exuberance and excitement, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, great to die for your country. It isn't, is what he's saying. And of course, this fits very nicely with the opening scenes of All Quiet on the Western Front again, because that's exactly what that teacher in that gymnasium was doing, full of enthusiasm and full of, patriotic exuberance. He's telling these kids, go off and fight for the fatherland. There's nothing greater. To die for the fatherland is the ultimate experience. It's the greatest joy. It's whatever. No, right? It's a horror. It's hell. It's indescribable suffering. It's brutal. Don't tell your children anything to the contrary, right? That's the message of dulce et decorum est, right? Again, one of the really important and models of World War I poetry. And now that we have actually a few minutes left, we can go back to that poem by Alan Seeger called Rendezvous. The first line of the poem, it's on page 3, I think. I have a rendezvous with death. By the way, just as an aside, this poem was the favorite poem of President John F. Kennedy. He's particularly fond of this poem. Now, Alan Seeger, the poet, was born in 1888 in New York City, actually. He died in 1916 on the Western Front in a battle engagement with the Germans. So you're asking yourself, wait a minute, the guy died in 1916, was born in New York, was an American. How exactly did he die in World War I when we didn't enter the war until April of 1917? The answer is he was always a Francophile, loved France, loved French literature, French culture. And so he moved to France. He was living in Paris. And when the war broke out in 1914, he decided he wanted to participate, although he was basically a pacifist, but he wanted to participate in World War I out of his love for France. So he joined the French army and died on the Western Front before the Americans even entered the war. And so that motivation really, cost him his life. It was, I wonder if he'd have been so fast to join for the American army, because basically at heart he was a pacifist, but his love of France was so great that it motivated him to join the war effort. And the name of the poem is Rendezvous. What is a rendezvous? It's a meeting up. When you say I'm going to rendezvous with someone, you're going to meet them. But this is not just any kind of a rendezvous. And that's clear from the first verse, the first line. I have a rendezvous with death. I have a meeting with death, right? So basically, what is the poet saying? I'm going off to fight in this war, and I know that more likely than not, it's where I'm going to die, because most soldiers do. Right? That doesn't mean he wants to, as we'll see towards the end, but it's more than a 50-50 chance that's what's going to happen. If you also look, it says, I have a rendezvous with death with a capital D. And by capitalizing death, it's more forceful. It gives death a real power, unlike with a small d. It makes it sort of a personality and one to be reckoned with, something very powerful. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air. It's a very interesting contradiction. First, he's talking about a rendezvous with death. Inevitably, he's going to die. And then the next line, he talks about when it's going to happen. When it's going to happen? In the spring, right? When the apple blossoms are in the air, right? Death and spring usually don't go together. Spring is rebirth, right? So everything's blossoming. So everything is coming back to life. So nature reasserts itself. Strange comparison, a strange side-by-side notions. I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair. So there's a juxtaposition, again, of death and rebirth. It may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land. Who's he talking about? Who's the he? Death. Might be that, death will take my hand and lead me off, right? And close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still, or maybe I'll get by. Maybe death won't get me so fast. I have a rendezvous with death. Right? It keeps repeating it though. And the repetition seems to imply a basic feeling of the poet that one way or another, death is going to get him. On some scarred slope of battered hill, when spring comes round again this year and the first meadow flowers appear. Again, this juxtaposition. Death is going to get me, but it's going to get me in a very, blossoming time of the year. God knows 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful step, asleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. So for a moment now, he's imagining what? What is this image that suddenly pops into his head? Be better to be pillowed in silk, to be home in your bed comfortably, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, where perhaps you're with someone and it's an image of love and togetherness and everything full of life. Right? But then it peters off. It's an ellipsis, ... At midnight in some flaming town, right? The image of a flaming town is war, right? A town on fire, things having been struck by bombs. When spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous. I made this decision. I'm going to war, so at some point, Death and I are going to meet up. I promised a rendezvous, promised a meeting, and inevitably it's going to happen. It's not something he's seeking out. It's not something he wants, but it's going to happen. And even though he'd rather it didn't, but he had the clear-sightedness, I guess, and the foresight to realize that having taken up this obligation and committed himself to fight, inevitably death will find him. And so that's Alan Seeger. As I said, he's the uncle of the famous folk singer, Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger, I guess, is known for the wild times of the Vietnam War era, when he had all these anti-war songs and so on. So apparently he had a tradition or heritage, whatever, from his uncle. But the uncle, unfortunately, fell in 1916 on the Western Front in the French offensive against the German army. And his rendezvous, in fact, became reality. He did meet up with death. So that's Alan Seeger. Now, this is a very small sample of World War I poetry. There are entire anthologies of World War I poetry because it inspired literary output more, I guess, than any other war, because it was in many ways the most horrible of wars. But it also, it's interesting that most of the poems are British. And these British poets actually had a tradition and a prehistory of literary accomplishments or interest in literature. All of these poets were writers or would-be writers even before they ended up on the Western Front. So it was only natural, I guess, that the war and experience and what they saw and what they participated in would actually move the muse for them to write it. Either they lived to see it published, or unfortunately, like Wilfred Owen and others, they didn't live for it. John McCrae didn't live to see it published. But the legacy is there. We're going to move on next time to the artwork of the period. Same story. Virtually all of the artists, now most of the artists that we're looking at are German, but a few British as well, Paul Nash and others, were all veterans also of World War I. And their experiences translated into their artwork in the 1920s. What's interesting with respect to German artists as opposed to the others is, as you well know, World War I was followed by the Weimar Republic, a nice period of freedom and lack of government suppression. And so you could paint whatever you wanted, write whatever you wanted without censorship, and let it all hang out. But of course, in Germany, unlike England, the Weimar Republic came to a crashing end in 1933 with the Nazis. Then what? Well, we know what happened, for example, with Erich Maria Remarque. Anti-war, forget it. That's anti-German. His books were burned. The artists, same story. They didn't burn necessarily their artwork. They considered it degenerate artwork. And it was either storehoused, so it was not on public view, or there were actually exhibits in Nazi Germany. It was known in German as Entartete Kunst, degenerate art. And they would show us, this is not German, it's degenerate art. It's not, pictures of nice young blonde-haired, blue-eyed young girls in dirndl skirts and, dancing around with the Alps in the background. No, this is grotesque. It's horrible. And it is grotesque, as you'll see, because it's representing the reality of the war. So these artists were persona non grata. They were not accepted in Nazi Germany. Most of them left. Many of them ended up in America and contributed greatly, including a movement that developed. We'll talk about it. It's not going to be enough time in one class, known as Dada, the Dada movement, which was an anti-art movement, but also an architectural school that came out of World War I. After the war, there was a need for housing and for mass production of products that people needed. And that led to what was known as the Bauhaus, the house of building. Bauhaus was a very interesting 1920s phenomenon in Germany of combining artistic sensitivity with mass production. And there were some very, very important figures in the Bauhaus who were architects. Some were painters, some were illustrators, some were designers. And one of them, I'll finish with this, was a very well-known and very successful architect. And if we ever get back to the Lehman campus and you walk by Schuster Hall, Schuster Hall was designed by Marcel Breuer, a very famous Bauhaus architect. He designed Schuster Hall. And if we have a chance to actually spend part of the next class talking about what Bauhaus is all about, you'll see why that's typically, it's a typical example of what post-World War I, 1920s German architectural design and practicality and functionality and so on are all about. I might add, it's not my favorite building on the campus, but it's designed by this famous architect of the Bauhaus, and it is landmarked. You can never tear it down. All right, so that's a piece of post-World War I art, architecture, right there on the Lehman campus. Any questions about any of the poems? Someone let me know. I don't understand why Dulce et Decorum Est wasn't in my packet. Maybe it just came out or was separate, or make sure you have it. If not, I'll just repost it separately. So we meet one last time on Tuesday. We can do the art. If you have any questions regarding the final or the term paper, of course, you can email me. I think what I'm going to do is every Tuesday at 5, I have a Zoom session with my 2 Holocaust classes because they're asynchronous and I never meet them. And so what I might do, what I will do is I'm going to invite all of you. I'll send you an announcement. You can also join next Tuesday at 5. It's not going to be a class, I'm not going to give a lecture or anything, but it's for everyone who has a question, regarding the final or the term paper or anything else. You can bring it up at that point. So you're also welcome to join us. And I'll send you an announcement, or you can always send me an email. But the final exam is coming up, and I just misplaced paper, but it's not that far off. Now what I do with it? It's the middle of the month, and the term paper is also due the day that the final exam is due. As I said, I will post the exam 2 days in advance, and then you'll just get it to me on the due date, which I can't believe I just misplaced. It's either the 14th or the 17th. I'll let you know for sure. And do it. This long distance business just isn't working out too well. Anyway, so that's it for the course. The last part will be, of course, the artwork. Any questions? Anything unclear? Okay, so we meet again on Tuesday, and at that point, we'll do the artwork. I'm going to post it later on today. It's a packet of about 10 or 12 reproductions of oil paintings and sketches. But it also has one or two interesting pieces of what's known as Dada art. I'll talk about that as well, because it's a very unique aspect of post-World War I art, and a clear reflection and response to what World War I was all about. Okay, so on that note, see you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Stay well, and I'll get that artwork up there for you.
You too, Professor.
Take care. By the way, if you said, is that Dulce et Decorum poem there, or was it missing?
I'll have to check. I'll email you if it's missing.
Okay, I'll send it. Maybe I'll just send it anyway, just to be safe. Okay, take care.
All right.